I'm Simon Barrowcliff. I'm the Senior Technical Specialist in Element. Go around there. There we are, that's me. Senior Technical Specialist in Element. My specialist area is product certification. And as I said, I've been doing this for 29 years in this particular business in various roles. I also head up the UK Conformity Assessment Board Mirror Committee, L6, which mirrors the IEC activities in conformity assessment, and also the subcommittee that works with the IEC EE as well. And finally, for me, since April of this year, I've also been elected as chair of the IEC EE. So I got my first meeting in Slovenia in June in that role. But we'll talk a bit more about the IEC and CB scheme when we meet again after lunch. So let's have a look. We're talking about risk and product compliance. I'm going to talk to you about this in the broader sense of CE and UKCA. When we're talking about CE and UKCA, they're similar enough. So when I refer to one, I'll refer to the other. So you can read across the two. And the important thing with risk assessment is that the rules are common across all of these directives, or as most of the directives in terms of product safety. And paraphrased here is the basic rule that says that your technical documentation as a manufacturer shall make it possible to assess the equipment's conformity with the applicable requirements, whether that be safety or EMC or radio, and should include an adequate analysis and assessment of risk. Now, this statement's been in these directives and regulations since they were first published. And they were so overlooked for about the first 10 years that it was only in later editions of the guidance did they pull this forward to make it a more prominent criteria. So this risk assessment I'm going to talk to you about today. We're going to use the RED, the Radio Equipment Directive, as our model for this. It's a typical directive in terms of the rules, and also because it covers radio, EMC, and safety. So we sort of kill three birds with one stone by using this regulation. And if you look in the detail in various parts of the directive, in its guidance that's associated with it, it clearly points to the importance of risk analysis and risk assessment by the manufacturer. So what is the process? I mean, we're probably familiar with risk assessment and risk analysis, but fundamentally it's identifying those risks that are appropriate to the product and the regulation in the context of wherever you're using it and whatever the product is. So you identify those risks, you analyze them, you take some form of action to mitigate those risks, you monitor those actions. I think that's the important thing. You monitor and then you control, and then hopefully that's all your risks removed. But the circle completes. It doesn't stop on control. It takes you to the next stage, which is about looking again at risk. And this is what Steve referred to earlier as ongoing conformity. You as a manufacturer under CE and UKCA have an obligation for ongoing conformity, which means this circle never stops. As your product goes through its various lifestyle stages, you need to come back to looking at these risks again. So that risk assessment that you do is the first thing you do, and it's the last thing you do. And you need to keep revisiting it because things change. I was having a conversation this morning about the changes in regulations, both our national and regional regulations, but for those of you exporting, multiple countries. Each time one of those little regulation changes, you need to go back to your risk analysis and see if there's any impact on that. Most of the time the answer is going to be no, if you're fortunate, but occasionally it will, and then you need to take some action at this stage. So from that risk analysis, you inevitably need to come to some form of product testing. And you ask yourself the question, why are we testing the product? Well, if it's nice and easy, if it's for your own information, if it's not for regulatory purposes, you can test what you like. Because it's for your own benefit. It's to help you determine the functionality of your product, perhaps. However, as soon as you go over onto the left-hand side of the picture here, you're into regulatory compliance. And then you're into testing what you need to do in order to meet whatever those regulatory obligations are. In the context of CE and UKCA, that's fairly well defined. As soon as you step outside that market and begin looking at the rest of the world, as I said, it gets very, very much more complicated. Test what you need is not the same as do as little as possible. You can opt to do the minimum, and that's what risk assessment and what the CE regime is all about. It's giving you the choice and ultimately the responsibility for the compliance of your product. But really, you should be chasing the carrot rather than avoiding the stick when it comes to compliance. One, because it's the right thing to do, it's ethical, but also, it's been shown over the years that products that comply with the regulatory requirements typically tend to function better as well. And there's a simple reason for that. If you can be bothered investing the time and the effort in proper regulatory compliance, then you certainly have spent more time on the functionality of the product. So that correlation is really, really important. So regulatory compliance, CE marking and doing a thorough compliance program helps support the quality of your product as well as those regulatory needs. So follow the carrot, avoid the stick. So risk in compliance, we're talking about risk management. What does that actually mean? Well, quite often people start with risk management, say my product's so simple, there is no risk. Or they say the test labs will cover it in the hope that when you bring a product to someone like Element, we'll test it, and then you get a bit of paper that says it meets these clauses of a standard, you might get a certificate at the end, and that's my job done as the manufacturer. The rules are so clear, anybody can understand it. And Steve touched a little bit about the complexity of rules earlier on. So when you're doing your risk management, if you think the rules are clear, again, perhaps an opportunity to think again. And then in terms of the risk, how many operating modes do you have to cover? How many do you need to address? How many can you safely ignore? So risk management is about considering, all of these aspects and not talking yourself out of doing things. And the process, that circular process I described earlier, is important in making sure that you don't miss any of these things or talk yourself out of doing the right thing and avoiding chasing your carrot. There are risks in everything that we do. My colleague, when he does a similar presentation to this, at this point would have brought out a pint of beer, stood it on the podium next to him, and used that as evidence of taking an extreme risk. Now, because I'm in an Element workplace, because my CEO is sitting 10 meters in front of me, and because our health and safety team are absolutely brilliant, they've not given me a flat surface to stand the beer on. So I'm saved from that. But risks are things that we have to deal with all the time, whether it's having a beer at a presentation, whether we pull out of a junction when we're driving our car. Risks are around us all the time in all that we do. And when we're considering risk assessment, we need to be objective, we need to be thorough, and we need to be realistic. As Steve gave a good example, if you've got a radio transmitter and it's transmitting up a pole in the middle of nowhere, you've got perhaps less concern about radiating human beings than if you've got a mobile phone that people are carrying around with them. So you have to be realistic, you have to be objective, but you have to be thorough. And the good place to start with that is its actual use. And you as the manufacturer are the expert in how a product is used. And this is what CE marking places upon you as that responsibility. It says, you are the expert, so you are best to determine these risks. And there's two criteria that you need to apply with those risks. It is whatever is being done to the product reasonable, and is it consistent with the intended function of the equipment? And you define that. You explain in instructions and guidance how you expect the equipment to be used, where should it be used, and who should be using it. All of those things really, really clear. And then is it foreseeable by the manufacturer? So is the use of the equipment a reasonable use of it? And is it something that you can foresee people doing as a manufacturer? Now, that doesn't mean that you can just assume that the customer is going to do everything properly and follow your instructions. It's up to you as the manufacturer to be an expert in how that product is used and feed that back into that circular process. So let me give you an example. This is a safety example rather than a radio one, but this is an electric oven, which a range of these had serious fires because despite warnings in the instructions, users of the oven at Christmas time, when you buy that slightly larger turkey than you should have done, inevitably on Christmas morning, stuff the turkey into the oven by whatever means possible. And that includes taking out all the shelves and what have you that's provided. And this particular product, they had a shelf on the bottom floor, which was providing breathing space to the ventilation system, the cooling system for the device. But users, despite the fact that it says in the instruction, do not remove the bottom shelf was removable. They were inevitably doing it. What was happening was these ovens were catching fire and burning people's kitchens down. Now, in terms of reasonable or foreseeable, was it reasonable for a consumer to use a domestic appliance in that way? Yes. Was it reasonable for the consumer to assume that the product would continue to function safely under those circumstances? The answer is yes to that as well. Was the misuse foreseeable by the manufacturer? Also, the answer is yes. The manufacturer knew that this situation could occur, but rather than spending the money on a thermal cutout in the device, they just put slightly bolder print in the instructions. So the act of the customer, whilst not in accordance with the instructions, was still reasonable, and it was foreseeable to the manufacturer of electric ovens that people are going to do this. So you have a responsibility, whether you're making ovens or whether you're making radio devices, to consider the holistic view of the product. You can't take too narrow a perspective. And when you're doing a risk analysis, the reason why that's such an important part and the starting part of your regulatory compliance process is you can bring together all the expertise that you have to try and think through these things. So it doesn't end up something at the end ends up in a non-optimal solution, as in the example here. Now, that's not to say that everything you do will be followed by your customer, and it's not to say that your customer will always be reasonable in their act, and that you can foresee every use. So let me give you an example.
I don't care, mate. Yeah? I feel like jumping.
Now, despite Network Rail spending many tens, hundreds of thousands of pounds installing lights, sirens, barriers, they've done what was the best that they could. Yes, it was foreseeable that somebody might try and push their way through the barriers in front of an oncoming train, but it's obviously an unreasonable thing to do, and Network Rail don't have a responsibility to actually completely physical stop us from crossing at a crossing. So reasonable and foreseeable is something you have to balance that. How idiotic is your user, and how far do you need to go to protect them while still fulfilling your responsibilities? And it's not as clear cut as saying, I have to do absolutely everything. You have to do what is reasonable in your eyes, and ultimately in the eyes of a court if you ever unfortunately end up in that situation. So reasonable and foreseeable are really important factors that your risk assessment needs to take into account. Now, we bring ourselves back to radio testing. Radio testing is clearly defined. There's multiple standards. If you come to a test house like Element, we will talk to you usually in the context of published standards, which hopefully you've designed to before you come to us. So is it reasonable to expect us as the test lab to cover all risks that are associated with it? And I've already answered that question for you by saying no. Because what we'll do is we'll work to those minimum choices that the standard sets out. The number of radio channels, the extremes of temperature, any of the parameters, the minimum requirements that you have to meet. And we'll test to that in accordance with what you tell us about the product. So we're back to that risk assessment. How are you defining the reasonable, foreseeable, the use conditions for that product? And that gives you, the manufacturer, those project choices. Are your radio channels flat? What's the real temperature that it's being used in, internal and external? Are there worst case considerations for cables, worst case modes of operation? Have you actually given us the worst case sample to test? All of those things are outside the remit of the test lab. You, when you come to us, can give us what you want, and we will test it. Because we're relying on you as the manufacturer who have done that risk analysis and that risk assessment. If you haven't done that, then we're going to give you what you ask us to do. And the gentleman from UCAS earlier was talking about the importance of us doing the right things in accordance with what you want us to do and in accordance with the standards. And because the standards don't give us every little detail of how we do a test, we're hugely reliant on you to bring that to us. And when we're discussing test plans, when you're working with us up front, perhaps with advisory services, pre-test, these are the discussions that we can have, and we can help prompt you with some of those considerations. Are the rules clear? Steve set out the rules for the EU and for the US in some detail earlier on. And yes, there's some clarity to it, and there's more guidance coming, and Steve reminded me that there's guidance on installation of modules coming up, which element have helped write in terms of Red CA and ETSI. But are the rules absolutely clear on how we install modules into devices? Lots of experience of installing modules into IT product over the years. But Steve used an example of a microwave oven. I'm using a washing machine here. There's a fridge example. These are domestic appliances that really aren't really Internet of Things, or weren't. They are now. Radio modules going into them. And it presents different sort of risks. Now, Steve went through these risks eminently in more detail than I am. I'm not a radio engineer. I'm a safety engineer. But the consideration of these risks in a product like a washing machine, it's important to have your RF expert present in the room and your safety expert present in the room so that your risk assessment covers all of those aspects of it. So you don't end up just doing a risk assessment for radio or a risk assessment for EMC and you forget to do the risk assessment for safety. So this risk analysis, my first slide, showed a little group of people huddling around a table. It's a team effort. And it needs to be a team effort at the start, and when you come back around that cycle again, it needs to be a team effort again, so that things don't get missed. So that when aspects change in regulations or in standards, somebody in the room can help draw your attention to that, so that you fulfill all of those obligations. So when you're installing radio modules, there isn't a definitive list of test cases. We, as Element, can't give you a test plan for your product, a generic document that we just go, oh, it's one of those, have one of these. Because almost every one of your products is different in some way. And certainly if you're putting radio modules in a host that hasn't had a radio module in it before, it could be a unique application of that module in that particular application. So when we're compiling, or when you're compiling test methods, it's going to be a unique set of tests for your product, and it's going to be guided by that risk analysis. How much you do, how little you do, will depend on where it's being used, who's using it, how it's being used. Guidance exists. We've talked a little bit about guidance already. But ultimately, if you're the host equipment manufacturer, you have ownership of that product. When you CE mark that product, when you FCC that product, when you Japanese cab the product, or whatever, you are saying my product complies with those rules and regulations. The module may be approved, but the module person isn't claiming full compliance in your end application. So you as the host have that ultimate responsibility to interpret the guidelines and apply the rules properly. And the test lab could advise, and we can advise. You know, we try not to let people flounder, and we have teams of people that will help point you in the right direction. But we shouldn't choose the tests, because we weren't there sitting with you around the table when you did that initial risk assessment. You as the manufacturer are the expert in that. And by all means, involve us in that process. Involve our advisory teams if you wish, if you need that level of support. But please don't rely on the test lab, because you have the product knowledge. And when you go back and look at the regulations, particularly the CE regs, it's putting that emphasis, that onus on you, because you are the product expert and you have that knowledge. Bring that knowledge to us, help us to guide you, yes, but don't assume that the test lab is going to do it for you. So, how does this bring you back as a manufacturer? Well, you all need to get your product to market very quickly, particularly when you get into the compliance stage towards the end. You know, someone wants to get some money back for their investment. We've been talking about investments today. Everybody needs to get a return on the investment. So you really have two choices. Is you can use consultants, you can use experts like Element, you can review reports, plan to minimize testing. Go into the pre-test preparation and put effort into that, or just test it. Do more testing, reduces the risk, because if you test every mode and every aspect of operation at every temperature, you will minimize the risk. You never remove it completely, but you will minimize it. But there's a time and a cost consideration for that. And the more complex the product, the more modes, the more testing if you just tested everything. So really, it's the right-hand side of the screen is probably where you go. Because that's what's going to determine your time to market, and ultimately, when you get that compliant final product to market. So your risk assessment has advantages to you. While you're chasing the carrot, you can then leverage the expertise to minimize the testing while still meeting the highest standards, fulfilling your obligations, getting to market quicker with a compliant product where you can be secure in your compliance statement. So when you fill out your declaration of conformity, you know that it's right. You needn't worry about fines and all the other sort of hideous sticks that come to beat you if you don't meet the regulation, because you're never going to fail because you've done it properly. So it's pre-planning, starting with that risk assessment. Calculated risks. This is what manufacturers commonly do cover. Choice of operating modes and settings, finding a worst case mode, the limits to testing when installing a module. You can take some consideration of that. Sometimes, particularly with radio modules, the EMC impact perhaps isn't considered. The product safety and health aspects may not be considered, and the impact of that on the host or on your module. And then latterly, I've had a few conversations about this morning, and we've touched on it. Cybersecurity matters. It's coming into red for radio equipment, but actually it's coming into everything. Everything that gets connected to the internet now, we've got to worry about cybersecurity. So that's another thing to add to your risk. So those of you who've got existing products where you're on that risk analysis cycle, when you come around again, cybersecurity is the thing to consider if you haven't considered it at the moment, whether you're following regulation or trying to stay in advance of that. So these are calculated risks which you can generally, manufacturers generally take into consideration. Unknown risks, mistakes made by the manufacturer. They don't screen for high powers, they don't use a worst case unit, so therefore you're not giving yourself a representative set of results. Guessing a worst case mode or model rather than going through a very thorough process to determine what that worst case is, and documenting it. Because when you document that worst case model, when you come around again when the product changes, you're starting from a position of knowledge. You don't have to go right the way back to first principles, because you can say, what did we do last time? How did we draw the conclusion on testing last time? Has my product changed, altered that? Whereas if it's not properly documented, you either skip it, it's too difficult, we'll just move on, or you have to do it all over again. And then not knowing every detail of the product. In the world we work in today, People like me worked for the same business for 29 years. Some of you have worked in your businesses for a long time as well. But many of you perhaps have only worked for businesses for 3, 4, 5 years. You weren't around perhaps when that first iteration was done. So you're reliant on what your colleagues did 3 or 4 years ago to guide you in that risk assessment. You also need to know the detail of the product. You can't assume you understand the product unless you've looked at it in some more detail. We as Element, when we're doing testing, when our test engineers, we encourage them before they test to try and understand what the product actually does, what its function is. We can't stand aside and just say, oh, it's just a product. Because if we don't understand how it works, what it's trying to do, what you're trying to do with it, we can't spot, potential big pitfalls for customers when they inadvertently miss things. So it's really important that the person who's working on the test plan, who's applying that risk assessment, has that knowledge of the product. And that's a challenge to us all, as I said, in a working environment where we don't stay perhaps as many years as we used to. How do you ensure that that knowledge of the product is passed on so that you can make these judgments of the who, what, where, and how it's being used? The other alternative is just close your eyes. Look at something frightening out there and say, if I don't look, then I'm not going to see it. If I don't test, if I don't investigate, if I don't have those conversations, if I don't do the risk analysis, then I'm not going to be aware of what the problems are. But you do have to address these issues, how you test when you've got multiple transmitters. You have to address what tests you need to do with pre-approved modules. You have to think about product safety. Otherwise, how do you know if your product passes or if it doesn't? And the answer is you don't know. So you have to take it seriously. And I think anybody involved in this assessment process, or CE process in its wider sense, if you're going to do it properly. There's really no point in doing it in a half-hearted fashion because you'll only get a half result. So if you're going to do it, you need to do it properly, and you need to face up to the fact that there will be changes to the product. There may be things that you need to address in your risk assessment and your test program that might cost you a little bit more money or taking you a bit more time. But hopefully, by doing that thorough process, it's not as much as if you'd done no thought at all. So, common mistakes that are made: a lack of objective assessment of risks, poor planning, and a lack of pre-testing. It's making sure you've got everybody in the room, that network of experts in terms of EMC, radio, product safety, cybersecurity now, and the functionality of the product and its aesthetics. All those good things all need to be in the room when you're performing those risk assessments. It's making sure the golden sample is representative. It's no good having a product that you keep having tested again and again and again, because that's the one on which you base your product on, if it actually isn't representative of what you make. If you look on the section 10.5 of the red, it says that you should consider the risks and potentially reevaluate or retest your product on the basis of those risks. And that's done on real manufactured product, not a golden sample that's been built in your laboratory. Production products, as we all know, are not the same as pre-production samples. Thinking it's simple. There's no safety involved in this, there's no EMC risk, there's no radio risk. Fooling ourselves down a path of least resistant risk management, being trying to do nothing rather than trying to really address the elephant in the room. So it isn't simple, it is complicated. The rules change, the requirements change. And then, as we said before, not knowing your product worst case. When you're having it tested, test it for its worst case operation in the foreseeable condition that your customers might use it in a reasonable fashion. Don't assume they're just going to do it by following in the instructions if you know better. So you choose the correct path. You learn and understand about your product, about the process, about the regulations. You seek expert advice to help you minimize the testing, to improve the quality of your technical file. to help you make that next step in 6, 12 months' time when you're making product changes. Be the best that you can be. As engineers, we all try and do that, I think. Engineers are naturally people, we're naturally perfectionists. Be the best you can be, make your best product. Chase the carrot. Because the carrot will give you a better product in terms of compliance and in terms of its functionality and happier customers. And when you come back again to start the cycle, when the product changes, when you do one of those reviews, that effort you put in the start will pay you dividends going forward, and you're less likely to come up with time-consuming fixes and complications. So risk assessment. It should be the first document you open as part of the compliance process. What's my risk assessment going to be? Who's going to be party to it? How are we going to do this? How are we going to factor this in? And keep revisiting it. And when you get to the end of the process before the product goes on the market, it's the last document you close. Because then you capture all of those use conditions, what you've marked on the product, what you've put in the instructions, all add to that risk assessment. And then it's the place that you start again. You start by opening your risk assessment and said, where did we get to last time? What's changed? How do we impact that going forward? And if we do that, we end up with the little blue thread. The little blue thread, making tomorrow safer today. We've mentioned it a couple of times doing through. And it's really important, this. I said, I've been doing this a very long time. But if you want to sum up my working life and what I've been doing, it's that. It's the thread that runs through my career. And for many of you out here in conformity assessment, that runs through. It's making tomorrow safer than today. And that blue thread is really important to everything we do, whether we're conformity assessment or manufacturers or designers or regulators in the marketplace. And part of risk assessment is a key element of that aspect. So, thank you very much for listening to that. I think, go on, you can do questions.
So, I'll grab the microphone. Has anybody got any questions for Simon on risk and his presentation? Yep, got one up the front here. Thank you.
Wonderful. Who? Yep. Hi, thank you. Wonderful presentation, Simon. Hitesh Farambia. I'm coming from the life sciences and pharmaceutical background, but your point around the carrot and stick is resonating with me. The question I have is in around how often do you involve the regulators and the notified bodies in some of this when it comes to risk assessment? I'm casting my mind back to when Audi was trying to launch a new model in the US and the regulators shut it down because they didn't understand the innovative technology that Audi were launching. Similarly, in life sciences and medical devices, how often do you get those folks into your people in the room?
Good question, and it's really important because it's understanding the regulation. The regulation, the directive, or whatever it is, says one thing, but it doesn't mean that the regulator reads it that way. I mean, if we're lucky enough, there's guidance issued by regulators. Here's the 3-page law, and here's the 60-page guidance document that comes with it that tells us how we're going to interpret that. So I think part of your risk assessment process needs to be saying, is what is our regulators' expectations of us in the market, and seek advice.
Yeah, I was also going to add to that. I mentioned earlier on about this RED CA, the Compliance Association, which is a fantastic forum of regulators, notified bodies, manufacturers, where we all come together twice a year to debate some real hot topics. And as an example, if you look in the official journal for the radio standards, there are a number of standards listed that have got a lot of restrictions to do with measurement uncertainty and tolerances. And they were inserted by the Commission, frankly, with a lack of understanding of those metrology terms. And through that forum, that mechanism of notified bodies, test labs, manufacturers interfacing directly with the regulators, they've now got to the point of understanding the basic concepts and have taken, or just about to update, for anybody that's interested, There'll be a new official journal in the next few weeks where a number of those restrictions have been removed because of that direct interaction. And so one of the things I would say is the regulations are there to support health, safety, and environmental protection, and they're best endeavors. But they need, in the same way that manufacturers need that feedback loop on risk, so do the regulators on listening to the industry and what actually needs to be done. So yes, the regulators do listen, is the summary. Sometimes it can take a little while, but it's only there to reflect the state of the art, as it were.
The UKCA, with it for its many faults and the many misguides that it's given us over the last 3 years, one of the things it has done is it has engaged the Department of Trade more with conformity assessment groups. So in the IEC groups that I'm in, for IEC for general product electrical safety and for EX for explosive atmospheres, we have representatives from the DBT actively involved in both of those groups now. Historically, they were involved in the ATEX group because it's the most risky, but they've actually re-involved themselves, re-engaged with us as a conformity assessment and in manufacturer community on the low voltage directive and IECE side, again, covering broader stuff, safety, EMC and cyber and things like that, as we'll talk about later. But they've engaged with our national committee to learn from us. And you can see that they're learning from us as well as to how things work. So it's really important as conformity assessment bodies and manufacturers to participate in these industry groups and keep pushing at regulators when they're not present. My colleagues on construction products have great difficulty getting their government representatives from the civil service to participate in that, and that's a shame from there. But we need to drag them out of their offices so they can come and listen to your experience as manufacturers and our experience as conformity assessment.
Cool. Any other questions? Yep. Just bear with me, I'll get the mic to you. There we go.
Robert Jackson from Becton Dickinson Medical. I'm involved in sustaining engineering predominantly, and this means when we change a major component through obsolescence, for instance, we need to look at the compliance and what things may have been affected, and that's a trigger for us to look at the risk assessment. But what I wondered if you could say a little bit more about what are the key triggers when you should revisit your risk assessments.
Okay. I think you've got one good one there is when the product changes, because that's an easy trigger. But back to my example of the oven with the turkey, and the manufacturer knew that ovens were catching fire before it started burning people's houses down because they were malfunctioning first. And that came back as part of their repairs and warranty cycle. What they didn't do is take any action on it. So that's a prime route for triggering a review of your risk assessment. It's that monitor on the cycle where you monitor what's going on. And that's taking feedback from your field service personnel, from your warranty returns, from your manufacturing process, who are telling you they're having difficulty making the thing properly in the first place. Any of those things can trigger. And what's really important is your quality system, where that describes when you trigger a risk assessment review, needs to identify those items. But certainly one of the things that's quite often, I'm not saying missed, but perhaps seen as a separate element, warranty returns and field service issues, perhaps don't get as quickly as they should to the conformity assessment team to enable them to open the file and try and make some of those changes. So I would say that's apart from obviously the routine product changes, but when something goes wrong in the field, it's about making sure you track that so that you can feed that back in. In medical products, I think 13845 sort of encourages you to do that, but actually it's in all of the regulations. It's not just a medical thing. We all should be doing it to some degree or another, is monitoring what's going on in the real world.
I think the medical is a great example of where you've got an industry that's very mature to that whole risk management life cycle that Simon's talking about. And actually, just in the medical world, there's a great example where if you're using wireless technologies to transfer essential information or basic safety data, maybe heart monitoring or infusion pump to a remote nurse station, for example. It may be that the wireless link is providing an essential performance aspect over that link itself. We do, because the standards require us to, wireless coexistence testing. So what happens, it might be a Bluetooth, it might be a Wi-Fi based system, but what happens if somebody comes in with another Wi-Fi router and uses it close to the nurse station? If the whole point of that wireless link was to alarm the nurse that the insulin or medication that they had has run out and therefore you need to fill it up again, if that link is broken, then there's a direct impact to somebody's health. We do wireless coexistence testing to replicate that. However, we all know in the latest phones that we've got, it was Wi-Fi 5, then we've got Wi-Fi 6E, soon to have Wi-Fi 7. We had a 4G phone and now it's a 5G phone. So although your infusion pump has never changed, the risks that it's exposed to have suddenly presented themselves, and you've taken something that was compliant, but now has got question marks associated with it. And so in the medical world, as Simon was saying, that 13485, revisiting and going round that loop, either because changes that you're making or state of the art has changed, is an absolutely critical part. And I would say the medical industry is a leading light for other people to be aware of, certainly in some of these newer industries like robotics and things like that, where you're using radio technologies, software, to make safety critical decisions about something, that the landscape changes and therefore state of the art does. And therefore you have to continually do it. It's up to you as the manufacturer to define what that timeline is. Is it annual? Is it biannual? Is it every month? That's down to you guys, and it comes back to Simon's point about the risk. Nobody understands your product better than you do. But these sorts of events, us highlighting some of the new things coming along, helps you in your job of going round that buoy on a regular basis. Come to you next.
Oh, Jason from General Motors. I guess we build vehicles, and the safety is one of our number one things. And I guess what's the right state of mind, or where do you draw the line in the way a customer, or what crazy way a customer can use your product? Because I mean, you can come up with people come up with the weirdest and craziest things to use your things, and they might be unsafe, and you can't really predict and get all these edge cases all the time. So kind of how do you draw the line, I guess?
You have to understand your user. So I give the example I give. We've all got table lamps at home. If you take the bulb out of your mains-powered table lamp and stick your fingers into the socket, you will get an electric shock. There's no other appliance in your home where you can hand remove a panel and stick your hand onto live parts, and yet that's permitted. Why? Because whilst it's foreseeable someone might do it, it's not a reasonable act for someone to do that. We all learn from very small not to put our hand on the top of the stove in case it's hot. You don't stop stoves from being hot, you learn. So you can assume, depending on your user, whether they're a lay person, whether they're children, whether they're elderly, whether there's someone working in a professional environment where they've had training, as to what level of expertise and knowledge that they should have. But it is down to you. You're responsible as the manufacturer for the product. So you don't need to protect against everything, my network rail example, but you do need to show that understanding of your end user and the way it's being used, and show that you're learning from common mistakes. So when you do identify common user issues, you have an obligation to do something about it, regardless of how stupid it is. But equally, nor do you don't need to protect your oven from people using it to bake clay models. It's patently an oven for cooking product. If it explodes because you do your pottery in there, that isn't something that would be a reasonable thing for them to do, although some people will do it. But you have to decide. And it's why when you're doing your risk assessment, it's best to be a group activity. It helps you, debate those, how far do we go from there.
Of course, it does come down to documenting it, because ultimately it's a court of law that will define what reasonable or unreasonable is. Yeah, exactly. Right, there was a question up here. Sorry. Yep.
Thank you. Thank you. David from BAT. Great session, Simon. Thank you. Given the cross-cutting nature of European framework, do you see the new product liability directive informing risk assessments in the future?
It's still down to the manufacturer at the end of the day, and it always has been. I think I don't think in real terms your liability has changed. All they've done is just pointed your finger at it, a bit like the re-emphasis on risk assessment. 10 years after the directives were released. It's not that it wasn't there, it's just that people were looking at other things on it. So I don't think it really changes what you need to do. Might make the stick a bit bigger. I think that's probably the best way of I can answer that.
Mark from Quail Digital. If I bring my product to Element and it goes through compliance, all is well, and then like we mentioned earlier about triggers, and we find something has gone wrong at a later date, is there a cooling off period, so to speak, with Element to retest it, or does it have to go through the whole process again with costs and so forth?
Do you want to answer that one?
Yeah. We're doing testing to help you, right? And the testing that we're doing helps you get compliant product on the market that is fit for purpose and safe. I think your question was, let's assume we've done testing. Was it if your product fails in the real world? Yeah. Sorry, for everybody else's benefit.
Similar to the example of the electric oven,
Yep.
when it's gone through compliance, but then something happens to go wrong.
Yeah, so we're a test organization. If you need us to retest your product, then we'll happily take your money a second time. But the testing that we do is the testing we do. If you want to come back and have another go at it because you found a real world problem, then that's another test. But it does highlight the need for doing a robust risk assessment to start with. Because the whole point of doing the testing is to make sure that you don't have a problem in the real world. And that's what Simon's referring to about that carrot approach. If you are thorough in your risk analysis and risk assessments the first time round, that real world problem shouldn't exist. And if it does, it's likely not your problem, it's a user issue. It's that test of unreasonable or unforeseeable. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you're at fault. It might be that the user has used it in a way that either was never envisaged or they're just stupid.
I think I can add to that
Frankly.
when you're looking at testing, one of the slides I said earlier, we will test what you want us to test and what you tell us about the product and how it's being used in those modes, particularly when you get into complex RF type environments. But even in product safety, it's this, we need to know how it's being used, what it's being connected to, who is using it, to make some of those clear judgments, to help us apply the standard and to help us develop a test plan. You as the manufacturer, can come to us and say, can you test to this standard? And that's what we'll do, to the best of our ability at the time. But it used to be said in the front of BS standards, it doesn't say this anymore, it used to say, compliance with a harmonized standard does not confer immunity from your legal obligations. So I would fall back on that and say, testing in compliance with a standard doesn't mean your product is either safe or compliant, it just means it meets the standard. In terms of the regulations, you have that broader aspect to it. So you can always engage with the test lab, with advisory teams to say, have I thought about everything? Have I considered this? Because you can get a different perspective on it. But I think for most organizations where you've got that broad knowledge, if you have got that broad knowledge in-house, then bringing all that knowledge together so that one can work off the other helps you avoid some of those issues. And if you think of that oven example, someone's talked themselves out of putting a thermal cutout in that device because the thermal cutout costs £1 and the wiring to it costs another £1, and on 100,000 units, they've just saved themselves a couple of £100,000. So a decision was made somewhere along the line likely to do that. It didn't just happen. Or people, ignored the wolf in the room and just said, actually, if I don't look, I don't see, don't worry about the carrot, I'll take the risk with the stick.
Great stuff. Okay, I'm conscious of time. We're pretty close to being bang on time, 2 minutes out. That's acceptable. That's within the terms of measurement uncertainty. So lunch will be served through there. Just a little bit of housekeeping. When we come back after lunch, we're going to go for a tour, and we're going to divide you into 4 groups. So what I'm going to do is say, these first 4 rows here, you are number 1. You guys here are number 2, number 3, and then number 4. So when we come back after lunch, you'll have a tour guide shouting out 1, 2, 3, 4, hopefully not the same person, and then you'll join them. There are 4 different areas that we're going to go to. We're going to go into an EMC chamber, a conducted radio chamber, a SAR lab, and some EMC testing. So those are the different stops on the way. So grab your lunch now. Afterwards, you'll hear me shouting, Team 1, and then you'll go off and we'll go and coordinate it. All come back after that for another couple of presentations. Okay? Through here, enjoy your lunch. Thank you.